This week on To the Contrary.
An historic number of XX candidates running for president. Then, the Equal Rights Amendment may not be dead. Behind the headlines, should young women be drafted?
Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, hashtag Women 2020.
Some of the earliest entrants into the 2020 Democratic primaries for president are women. More than half the candidates who've announced thus far are female. They include Senators Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, and Kamala Harris from California. Less well-known are Representative Tulsi Gabbard, best-selling author and lecturer Marianne Williamson. Harris is garnering the most attention, helping to frame the debate around Medicare for all, anti-poverty politics, free college, and more. Some experts say the early Democratic candidates are too far left-leaning, even prompting former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz to say he's considering running for president as an independent because of that progressive turn.
So, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, what role will women play for president in 2020?
In a word, Bonnie, outsized. And that's not only because there's so many of them.
It depends on the woman. If there's a centrist, moderate candidate to emerge, they'll play a very big role.
I just think for the first time, we're going to get to see a variety of perspectives and experiences, and it will be very difficult to stereotype any one of them.
I think breaking out of the mold of gender being an incredibly important characteristic, and at this point, just another attribute to another candidate.
You think we're at that point yet?
I think that if we have this many women running, and if they're willing to ride it out, I think it could make a lot of progress in that respect.
But we've already seen the semi-implosion of Tulsi Gabbard's campaign. How long do we think these women are going to last? How many of them are going to make it up to the last primaries?
Let's see how many of them can raise money, because that's really all that counts. So I predict that there will be more shrinkage than we might imagine. That popularity won't count nearly as much. Now, you see Kamala Harris going first because there's a primary and for the first time early in California, and that gives her a leg up, and because there's a lot of money out there. But the others will have a harder time.
And all three of them, by the way, all three of those senators have refused are saying they will not take corporate money. And they're building big internet followings so that they can just put the word out. I think, the internet and raising money in presidential politics has been going on for a while now. But this might be the year where they raise more money from online donors in small amounts than they do from corporations.
Well, that might be, but money is still important, and Donald Trump has an absolutely enormous advantage in the money he's already raised. More importantly, the same advantage as he had in 2016, which is name recognition. Most of the people we're talking about, men and women in the Democratic Party, with the exception of Joe Biden, are unknown quantities. The American people don't know them. And how one of them is going to break through the pack and emerge in a way that gives them credibility. You're talking about relatively junior legislators, mostly. You're not talking about governors. You're not talking about people who've had a big executive role.
Well, you and I remember a time when you couldn't run if you didn't have governor in your pedigree.
Absolutely.
And now they're all senators running, and you said, they're not this, they're not that. You described Barack Obama to a T.
Well,
when you said
some of us were not really pleased that a first-term senator became president and thought he was inexperienced in the job, and some of us also believe that his presidency was partly responsible for the Trump phenomena. So, not all of us, even those of us who don't like Trump, are all that looking back nostalgically at Barack Obama.
Let me just build on that. I mean, one of the things that I don't think the Democrats realize is that historically speaking, an embattled incumbent typically wins re-election. So whether we're talking about, Ronald Reagan in 1984, who after 1982, that wasn't so certain, or you're looking at, Bill Clinton in 96, or George W. Bush in 2004, or Barack Obama in 2012. But embattled incumbents typically win.
Most neutral observers see this as an extremely aberrant presidency. I mean, there's not been that before. The guy is so unstable. But
if he has no competition, and there is essentially
there may be
a year and a
Senator
half of Democrats beating each other up on the trail, then there is a real question on the money side and on the reputational side as to whether or not the Democrats will be able to kind of overcome the hurdle of a Rose Garden strategy.
And you can't beat somebody with nobody. I mean, that's the problem.
Well, but that somebody, when they finally get the nomination, will be a household name at that time. So I don't think we have to worry about that. But I worry about Democrats going off the left cliff. And do you see that? And that's not going to appeal to mainstream America at all. That's why Howard Schultz was toying with the idea of jumping in.
Well, I see it as a disadvantage for the general election. And in trying to outdo one another, for example, using what amounts to a slogan, Medicare for all. Well, I can give you half dozen varieties of Medicare for all. So I hope that we break that down so that we don't just we who are Democrats, don't just hand the Republicans a not talking point, but perhaps
a weapon.
Yeah. That's the word.
Yeah.
No, and then I think even more concerning than Medicare for All, which the Mercatus Center valued at $32.6 trillion, is this Green New Deal that everyone's seeming to line up behind.
One
Green
person.
New Deal, in order... Elizabeth Warren called for it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has called for it.
She's not running for president.
Kamala Harris called for it. Kamala Harris called for inner town hall. And what would it do? To combat climate change, it would ban nuclear energy, our single greatest weapon to combat greenhouse gas emissions. It would ban cap and trade. It would mandate a federal jobs guarantee. It has been valued at $49.1 trillion. Elizabeth Warren's wealth
What about
tax,
free college?
Free college would be $500 billion. And Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, in the first decade alone, it would be a one-time payment of under $3 trillion. And you're telling me that all that wealth would stay in the U.S.? No, it wouldn't. You'd have the same phenomenon that you have in France of people emigrating from the country. To a lesser extent, we already have that in California. We already have that in New York. So I think that if, for instance, someone like Senator Amy Klobuchar were able to come into the race and define the fact that a Democrat can just be a temperate, sane, liberal counterpoint to the insanity and the bells and whistles of the Trump administration, she could have a real shot.
All right. Well, we'll be watching it. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter and at Bonnie Bay, at To the Contrary. From female presidential candidates to equal rights for all.
The Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, is one state away from ratification.
When we started this in 2009, the ERA Education Project, they'd laugh in my face and say, it'll never happen. It's dead, dead, dead. Cut to 10 years later, 2.5 states later, about to get this job done.
Actress and activist Kamala Lopez is part of Equal Means Equal, an organization pushing to ratify the ERA. In 1972, Congress passed the ERA and sent it to the states. By 2017, 35 out of the necessary 38 states had ratified the ERA. Then Nevada and Illinois joined. Now the measure remains stuck in the Virginia legislature.
It is not dead in Virginia because we have the votes. All we need is to pressure the House of Delegates in the state of Virginia to do their job, which is simply to put the legislation up for a vote. Should that happen within the next 20 days, we will rejoice.
There is debate about whether the deadline for ratification has passed and if it matters that 5 states have decertified their original votes. But Lopez says lawyers for Equal Means Equal say that one last vote is all that's needed for the rights of women to be codified in the Constitution.
My full interview with Kamala Lopez is available on our TTC podcast, on our website, on iTunes, and SoundCloud. So, Lara Brown, I have two questions for you. The first one is, do we need an ERA? And the second one is, if it's only the insertion of a couple of words in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, then why not?
Well, so let me just say that on the one hand, we probably don't need it because we do have a variety of statutes that already address discrimination. But I do think that one of the things that's important to realize about it is that those statutes at the legal level put the onus or the burden essentially on the individual who is making the claim that they are being discriminated against. So by inserting these words into the Constitution, what you do is you relieve that sort of burden on the plaintiff, and it becomes now a mandatory part of our world. So there is some reason for it.
So it shifts the burden of proof to the defendant?
And it shifts the burden to a sort of, it has to be equal on its face, right? And to not something that has to be proved that there's been discriminatory practice or there's been bias in hiring or any of the other many issues that women raise when they raise these issues under a 14th Amendment claim.
And what about that it's only a change of a few words? Why not have an ERA?
I think the fear is that, so we already have the 14th Amendment, we already have the Equal Protection Clause, and you know, obviously we do have in the private workplace discrimination protections for women. I think the fear is that is this just some sort of Trojan horse for a progressive political agenda that could be used to force more abortion in more conservative states, against the conscience of the voters, against the conscience of the courts.
Exactly.
And then,
how do you see the ERA
because
as accomplishing
if the ERA is applied
that?
to the idea of reproductive justice or reproductive equality, it could be used to expand abortion laws to like what we're seeing in Virginia and in New York, in which effectively third trimester abortion, which only 13% of Americans support, is made legal.
You know, there's no equivalency there that men do something that's equivalent to abortion, so there has to be equality under the ERA. The most salient argument, the one that was used when we were in the streets trying to get the ERA, is unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. And that is really what upset the kibosh here. And you know, this, because I was in the streets trying to get it, I think Eleanor was at last street and we were heartbroken. I must say, to go through this again, and I hate to put the kibosh on this, but anybody who thinks that because we just got a few more states and we can add them on, do not understand how the constitutional amendment process works. It isn't left open forever until you get enough states. That's why we had to extend it twice. Right. So you can't just add states. And what about?
So you're saying that the statute has told, and they're not
defunct.
Yeah.
And so what you have to do is start all over again. Mm-hmm. And in this climate, an ERA, give me a break.
And in fact, the Constitution is pretty gender neutral. The word person is used throughout the Constitution, with the exception of voting. And of course, it took a constitutional amendment to give women that right. And I guess the old arguments used to be, well, we can't pass the Equal Rights Amendment because then we can't have separate bathrooms. And we can't pass the Equal Rights Amendment because then women will have to serve in the military. Well, those arguments seem pretty old-fashioned now. I haven't heard the argument about abortion yet. But the fact is that under the law, women are, in fact, entitled to equal treatment. And, you know, I think Eleanor is right to sort of...
Then why do we still have, you know, a half century after second wave feminism, why do we still have, you know, Me Too? Why is all this stuff going on that's still so
Me Too is not going to be solved by adding a few words to the Constitution.
Well, but it is being solved by litigators.
Yeah, but
the fact is,
what's being litigated in Me Too?
They're suing, you know, people who have been assaulted are suing the men who've assaulted them.
Well, these are practices. This is not law.
Yeah, right.
And that's the important thing. When you talk about the ERA, you're talking about legal. The law
opening up the Constitution?
No, you're talking about the law working against for one sex and against another.
Yeah, and the Constitution, by the way, I mean, the way in which it works is that for it to reach constitutional decision, it has to be state action.
Yes.
You know, you're not talking
State
about...
action and 2/3 of both houses.
No,
of
no,
Congress.
no. I mean state action in terms that it has to be the governments that's doing the discriminating.
Right, right.
You pass legislation to deal with private discrimination that then can be found discriminatory or not discriminatory under the 14th Amendment. But people somehow think that, you know, our Constitution is very pristine for a reason. It's worked very well. And unless you can show me right now that there is such pervasive state action against women, I'm not sure it's worth opening up the can of worms.
There could be, though, obviously conflicts between states, which is also something that brings a case to the Supreme Court. But I think the larger issue here is exactly what is being discussed, which is this is not going to all of a sudden happen if Virginia were to suddenly ratify. There have been 5 states that have actually rescinded.
Decertified,
yes,
we talked
their
about
ratifications. There is also the reality that an abortion controversy is already roiling the Virginia legislature and governorship. So that doesn't look to me like it's going to be a state where Republicans are going to cross the aisle and vote in favor of the ERA. And then you've got this other issue of all these other people who did ratify. Do they still want to be considered ratified?
And whether the decertification is,
Yes.
you know, preempts the certification.
And then we have the reality that even if we were to try to extend it, maybe the Democrats could vote that out of the House, but it would die immediately going to the Senate. So there's no hope, at least as far as I see, procedurally for an ERA.
Except starting all over again.
That's right.
And is that a wise use of energy in a case, in a world where we still have Brock Turners and rape kit backlogs and all of these things that we could be focusing very concrete bipartisan energy into combating?
Absolutely.
All right, behind the headlines. The draft. Men ages 18 to 25 are required to sign up for the Selective Service System, which in turn means they can be drafted. Women are not only not required to sign up, they are actually barred from doing so. A new congressional commission is taking a look at the Selective Service and asking, should women be required to register?
In 1981, the Supreme Court upheld an all-male draft on the basis that since women were excluded from combat, Congress wouldn't need to draft them. But things have changed.
In about 2015, all restrictions for women serving in the military were finally lifted. And that raised the obvious question. Well, if women can serve in any kind of capacity, then shouldn't they also be required to register for the draft? And then it raised even more questions, like, do we even need the draft?
3 years ago, Congress created the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service to answer these questions. Dr. Janine Davidson is on the commission, which just released an interim report leading up to a final recommendation to Congress next year.
We've basically been on a listening tour for this whole year. We've been to 15 states, 24 cities. We talked to over 300 organizations, but we want to hear a lot more from a lot more people. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to issue the interim report, to sort of say, we're here. This is what we've heard so far. Tell us what you think.
While the recommendations aren't binding, we are told the commission is leaning toward suggesting changes to the status quo.
Part of the status quo is that the system for selective service is sort of antiquated. So even if we decided to keep the policies the same, the way in which people engage with the system, the way they sign up for the system, the way they're exposed to other opportunities, we will make recommendations so that will not look like the status quo.
Davidson says many Americans simply don't know much about the draft, but polls show Americans generally support requiring women to register if men must do so.
If we're going to have it, then more people than not say that men and women should both register, especially given the nature of war. It's complex. We shouldn't leave talent on the table if we have a real, no kidding, catastrophic, existential national emergency, then many people say, then why would you not want to leverage the talent across the spectrum? And it's not just about ground combat. It could be high-tech skills, it could be administrative skills, it could be all kinds of things.
The commission is also focusing on alternatives to today's version of military service. One idea is to encourage but not require students to do 1 year of service after completing high school.
We had something like 10,000 applicants every year for the Peace Corps, but it's only funded at a level of about 3,500. So there's all these people that really want to serve and want to do things for their country or go abroad, and there are not enough opportunities for them. So what could Congress do to inspire more people to serve? They could provide more opportunities. They could advertise more. They could put more money into a lot of these programs that are very popular and that do amazing things for communities all over the country and around the world.
So, Linda Chavez, why not just ask women who are in the military? They make up 15% and rising of the military at this point in time. Why not just ask the women who are there? Because overall, they want every opportunity that men have. And they see, they want to serve and they want to be able to be promoted as they serve.
Well, it's interesting because back in the day when women in combat was a hot issue, they did, in fact, do polling among women who were in the military, and there was a deep divide. Women who were commissioned officers in the military wanted combat positions opened up to them. Women who were not commissioned, who were just, GIs, essentially did not. They were not all that enthusiastic about going in, for example, in the infantry, for going into combat. But I think there is a bigger issue. But
combat is such a teeny percentage.
And it's also very different. I mean, you can have, anybody who's seen any movies recently about wars knows that a lot of our wars are fought with people sitting in Arizona, with drones and dropping bombs that way. And obviously women are going to be as good at that as men, and they're not going to have, suffer. If they're moms, they're not likely to suffer injuries because of it. But the bigger issue to me is whether or not we should have a draft. I happen to be one of the few conservatives out there who believe the draft is good, that we ought to have universal service, that being a citizen in the United States should come with some duties as well as some rights. And if we're going to have a draft, I think both men and women ought to be open to it.
Do they even have a choice anymore? With women, 15% of the military. I mean, it's not like you can chop off that 15% and still keep it going, right?
Well, look, I agree with Linda completely that if they're going to have the draft, we should have women register for it. In fact, one of the things that I've long said is that it's, I think, at some level, hard to say logically that a woman should be commander-in-chief of the United States, and yet she's not even eligible for the draft. So I do think actually progress for women is having the duty as well as the opportunity to serve.
I'd really like to distinguish between the draft and registration. Now, yes. I would be for everybody registering. I'm against the draft. We got rid of the draft, people.
I know.
We used to have a draft.
But don't you think that
I like it.
all your fellow members of Congress, when they vote on whether to go to war, don't you think they should have kids in the military, and that would influence their decision?
Again, I'm against drafting people who don't want to do anything. The whole notion of drafting is un-American. Now, I do believe that the United States has to be ready for whatever, because we are the leading power in the world, and I don't see anything wrong if you're making men register, to make women register, let everybody come in, let's see how fit they are. That's all right.
But you're talking about, I mean, there would only be a draft if we got into some major
World
conflict.
War II, we wouldn't have been able to win World War II without the draft, and it was controversial then.
Right. You're talking almost 100 years ago as far as most of us are concerned. And we probably would be able to win the next World War without a draft. But we don't have to get there in order to have everybody register in case we need to get there. And I really am against saying because there might have to be a draft, so we also have to have everybody sign up for some social service. That, too, it seems to me, takes away from the American notion of liberty.
Quickly, Tiana, your thoughts. I mean, less than 30 seconds.
So I think that, I mean, having a selective service and having something, if we do have to enter World War III, is important. The reality is that we are the global peacekeeper of the world and that we must stand by that. And we must be willing to defend that honor in the rest of the country. That being said, pulling from the draft, I think it is important to make the distinction that even women who pass the test to go into combat do not fare as well in the long term, and that we need to seriously
Okay, I've got to
evaluate that.
run. Thank you. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.